Okay, so if we don't get them while they're young, can we still save them or convert them at the other end of their education? So I'm going to focus on, that's not me. I'm going to focus on graduate education in architecture. I've been teaching a seminar on neuroarchitecture at the University of Colorado since 2007. I always end up with a mix of architecture, landscape architecture, planning, and urban design students. I also actively solicit interest from outside the college. I've had non-design related students from disciplines such as education and even two practicing attorneys take my course. I think there's a lot of advantages to having interdisciplinary perspectives, but as I said, I'm going to focus today on why I think this is important specifically for architecture graduate education. So today I'll offer a framework that I use in this course as a way of linking the neuroscience and architecture disciplines. That's me, thanks. And talk through some lessons learned throughout my years of offering the course, including some things that didn't work, and some of the more salient lessons that seem to follow the students beyond the class into the professions. So at the 2003 AIA convention, Dr. Gage suggested that architectural design will be a subject of study in the clinical sciences. So alternatively, can neuroscience be a subject of study in architecture? What's the value of learning neuroscience for a future architect? Neuroscience research, as the evidence has been overwhelming at this conference, as you've seen, can provide designers evidence about the relationship between humans and environments. So I'm not going to say much on that point. But more generally or more pragmatically speaking, the profession is changing. We are moving towards a performance-based, evidence-based design. Our clients are increasingly demanding research, and research is adding value to the design of their capital assets. Therefore, education is being reconsidered to better prepare future architects to respond to this cultural shift. Looking ahead, our goal is to create a new culture of participation so that designers working collaboratively with researchers can guide and contextually situate the application of neuroscience and natural science research results. The National Architectural Accreditation Board, NAB, who sets the criteria for architecture education, has responded to the changing professional culture during its most recent 2008 accreditation review. So here I'm showing the NAB conditions that I think are most relevant to the study of neuroarchitecture. And in this 2009 column, I underlined the new and revised pieces of the 2009 conditions. I think it's noteworthy, especially the acknowledgement of a need for design for sensory and cognitive abilities under the accessibility condition, and this new applied research condition suggesting that there's a place for that as well. So if we want to participate, if we want future architects to participate in the formation and application of neuroscience knowledge, how do we educate students for this? Well, as you've heard, several of my colleagues here today and I started our neuroarchitecture journey under ANFA's Research Associate Program. This program was established by ANFA in 2005 under John Eberhardt to train a handful of emerging architects in neuroscience and neuroscientists in architecture that we might build bridges between the disciplines. So I'll share my own story as an example of how this worked. So after completing my graduate study in architecture and practicing for several years, I became a research associate, which provided me the opportunity to work with a cognitive neuroscientist at George Mason University on fMRI studies looking at cognitive processes across the life cycle. And this lab experience provided me exposure to neuroscience methods, laboratory study, grant writing opportunities. So it was very valuable. That was sort of my education in neuroscience. Our group of research associates remain dedicated to continuing to cultivate cross-disciplinary research, knowledge sharing, and application. So in this sense, I think that the research associate model is a successful approach to interfacing the disciplines, but it's not sustainable or reproducible for large quantities of students because of the challenges with research between the fields, the potential theoretical and methodological boundaries that separate the fields, that methods of knowing and learning about the environment lie at extreme ends of the research spectrum, and knowledge acquisition to become an expert in either field takes years of graduate study. Historically, research in architecture has been situated at the applied end, and I think it's important to acknowledge that most future architects, unless they pursue a PhD, will not be performing experimental scientific research. I told you I would mention things that didn't work in my course. In one of the early iterations of the course, as the seminar's capstone, each student designed a research project proposal based on a specific design interest they had. So this included preparing a literature review, developing hypotheses, and outlining a methodology, almost like writing a grant proposal. My hope was that some students would be inspired to perform the research, and that didn't happen. They didn't have the skills to perform the experimental research, and really it wasn't interesting to them. It was too far from design, which they were really more passionate about. When I looked at, I did a review of the literature on student motivation and attitudes about research, and found that students prefer to engage in research when it offers personal meaning, psychological ownership and control, and professional relevance. So my teaching approach to integrate research into the courses to improve attitudes and motivations towards research is through targeting those motivational factors. So this has been mentioned a couple times today, that the study should be interdisciplinary. Architecture was not the first profession to look to neuroscience to advance the discipline. In 1997, John Brewer wrote a seminal publication on neuroscience and education, calling the two fields a bridge too far, speaking out on brain-based education and policy, which at the time was attempting to establish a direct correlation between neuroscience and education. This was around the time that those baby Einstein products were being marketed. As an alternative, Brewer promoted a model that would triangulate knowledge using the discipline of cognitive psychology as an indirect bridge to link the more disparate disciplines. So in the case of neuroscience and architecture, we can implement a similar model using cognitive science and create an interdisciplinary framework, and through that interdisciplinary lens, establish a relational understanding between neuroscience and architecture and arrive at a more holistic reading of the human-environment relationship. So in terms of learning outcomes, even though architects do not directly perform experimental research, nonetheless, designers should be able to make use of research findings to inform their designs. And to support that skill development, these are the three main learning outcomes that form the basis of my course and drive the assignments and projects. First, understand environment-based human needs and interactions using knowledge from the neurosciences. So we spend a significant amount of the course building up a foundation of neuroscience knowledge across a wide range of topics through readings, expert lectures, and experiential learning. There are two projects in my course. In the first of the two course projects, students analyze these needs and interactions by synthesizing cross-disciplinary research. So they perform a literature review on a topic of their choosing, searching research manuscripts in neuroscience journals, that's required, and across disciplines. The hope is to show that they can distinguish between more and less robust studies and compare and contrast relevant studies. And then in the final project, they apply appropriate responses to design by performing an environmental audit on a case study environment to demonstrate an ability to correlate current research to potential applications in design. So how to teach neuroscience, how do I try to make it personally and professionally relevant? A lot of the foundational learning is framed in these interesting ethical debates that we have. So, for example, a study was done by one of my colleagues at University of Colorado Boulder, Chris Lowry, finding that the soil bacterium, Mycobacterium vaccae, activated serotonin-producing neurons in mice. And this led to a popular press article in Discover magazine asking, is dirt the new Prozac? So my students were asked to read Lowry's publications, as well as some papers on immunology and on the hygiene hypothesis, which proposes that it's sterile environments, that our environments are too sterile and that this is causing allergies and immune responses in humans. So they were then asked to come prepared to class with a definitive position on this statement. Piping soil bacteria into buildings to counteract depression contributes to healthy environments. Now let me say, this is not a statement put out by Lowry. It's an extremist prompt that I made up intending to stir up a debate. We don't want our students to do that. We don't want anyone to do this. But it was an opportunity to talk about why we shouldn't do this. So we talked about the 1950 Serratia bacteria spread by the government in San Francisco. And then we were also able to cover those other topics about hygiene hypothesis, immunology. We talked about the other end, sick building syndrome. Another debate that we have in the class, the Denver Art Museum, Libeskind's Hamilton building is in our city. So this debate is aimed at fostering an awareness of an ethical disposition toward inclusive design. Since existing design guidelines for cognitive accessibility are only starting to be recognized in the way that guidelines for physical accessibility are, I think it's a timely issue for designers to consider. And the Denver Art Museum is an environment which is reported to create unintended perceptual challenges for some users because of the disconnect between visual input with the angled walls and vestibular inputs. So it causes dizziness in some users, allegedly. And it served for us as a case study to frame a debate on ethical issues surrounding design and cognitive accessibility and creative liberties that designers can take and how that influences people's perceptions. So finally, these are some of the examples of the course projects that I described earlier. As I mentioned, they first are asked to perform a literature review and then find an actual environment where they can correlate the literature they found and begin to make some design recommendations. And their choice of both the topics and case study environments is something that is meaningful to them. So I'll end there, but I just want to say that my former students have gone on to become collaborative colleagues, and these students and those who are presenting here at this conference are definitely my success stories. So I'm going to turn it over to Margaret.